Machiavelli says, but as for the exercise of the intellect, so in other words, he's not saying you should be out in the field training your armies all the time. There are exercises to be conducted for the intellect. But with those, he says the prince ought to read histories and to consider in them the actions of excellent men, to see how they govern themselves in wars, to examine the causes of their victories and losses, in order to avoid the latter and to imitate the former. So he now grants there is a place for exercise of the mind, but exercise of the mind should be reading the history of those who have excelled in war. In other words, this points in the direction, as we will see later, of a change in the understanding of the relationship between theory and practice. And by that, I simply mean this. Point. Just based on what you've read in this chapter, what would you say for Machiavelli is the relationship between theory and practice? Or, speaking more generally here, between the theoretical and the practical life?
I would say that he values the lessons of the practical over the theoretical.
That certainly appears to be the case. Now, he does value the theoretical, or in this case, intellectual pursuits, but he values those intellectual pursuits that conduce to what, and to what alone?
Victory.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
We need the troops and the leadership.
No, that's right. So he values these intellectual pursuits or theoretical pursuits insofar as they help practice. So therefore, for Machiavelli, it appears from what we're reading now, and we'll get into this more as we go into other chapters, it appears that theory is good insofar as it serves practice. Now, is there anything particularly Machiavellian about that? Here's what makes it different. Plato and Aristotle and all the thinkers before Machiavelli understood that theory can help practice. But they thought that in the final count, that understanding itself, not understanding the actions of great warriors, not understanding the practical necessities of ruling, but that understanding of the highest things which don't change, understanding the good, the true, and the beautiful, that these were the highest activities of which a human being was capable. And so therefore, yes, theory does inform practice, and there is a certain degree of harmony between the two, but in the final count, understanding in itself, the contemplative virtues are the highest. And not only do they not speak directly to practical affairs, they are highest because they don't speak directly to practical affairs. Because practical affairs for classical political philosophy are not the highest things, because they change. And yet, as Aristotle says, human beings change because they're not divine. He says the God never changes. Well, why not? The God never changes because, says Aristotle, the God, being perfect and self-sufficient, if he were to change, that would mean that somehow he had improved himself by moving from point A to point B. But that would imply that he was not self-sufficient when he was at point A. And so therefore, as a sign of the perfection of the God, as Aristotle puts it, the only activity that the God can engage in, consistent with the God's perfection and self-sufficiency, is thinking. And Aristotle says, and the God's thinking is a thinking of thinking, meaning it thinks about its own activity, because again, to think about anything else higher than itself to think about anything outside itself would suggest that it's not sufficient by itself. Now, these are notions that we'll go into more detail as we go on. But my point here in this chapter is that for Machiavelli, there is a movement here where theory is lowered Theory does not exist at the highest anymore, at least apparently in this chapter. Instead, theory remains good, but it remains good only insofar as it serves practice and is therefore inferior to practice in the manner in which all means are inferior to their respective ends. And again, we'll see this more as we go on, but this chapter here prepares us for that new ground that he's going to take us to.